I recently heard a story of a very interesting experiment called the Dartmouth Scar experiment. As the name suggests, it was conducted at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, and it involved makeup artists painting scars onto the faces of about 50 people, both male and female. Now, after the scars had been drawn on their faces, they showed the participants what they now looked like with a pocket mirror so they could get used to their new identities. And then they were told to leave the room, go out into the world, start interacting with people, and generally go about their daily business. And the researchers said the point of this experiment is they want to find out if people now treat them differently or discriminate against them even as a result of these facial disfigurements. But here's where it gets really interesting. This is the clever part of the experiment. Before they left the room, the makeup artist told the participants that they just needed to touch up the scar just a little bit further to make it look extra realistic. But what they were actually doing was removing the scars entirely. So the participants left the room believing they still had the scar on their face when actually they didn't. It had been removed, which makes the results of the experiment very, very interesting. Because when the participants returned, they overwhelmingly reported that people had indeed been staring at their scars all day, that they'd been victimized as a result, and that people had generally been more mean and more rude to them than normal. Some participants even reported that some people had subtly referenced the scars on their faces during conversations. Now remember, the scars didn't actually exist. This was all in their imagination. And what this experiment proved is that when you prime people to see discrimination, discrimination is what they will see. They'll see it all around them, even when it doesn't exist. They will become paranoid. And this is something that intersectional theory has done to people in our society today. It has made them paranoid. This theory tells people that just because of their sex or skin color or some other trait, people will discriminate against them because they're naturally racist and sexist. And having had this information pumped into them, they are now primed to see that everywhere, even when it doesn't exist. And this paranoia is causing people to behave really uncharitably towards one another. There's a story the Scottish comedian Billy Connolly once told that can help us understand, so I'm going to play this clip.
My sister told me this, and she got on a Glasgow bus. Oh, please be true. And she sat down, and it just happened to be the last seat. And the bus took off and trundled off into the day. 4 or 5 stops later, the bus stops and a wee dwarf woman comes on. The wee woman got on the bus, the wee dwarf woman, and discovered there's no seat, and so hung on to whatever was nearest, the seat to the pole or whatever, and the bus took off. There was a wee schoolgirl in a school uniform sitting over here, probably urged along by her mother. Give the woman your seat. Give that woman your seat. She went over to the wee dwarf woman and she said, excuse me, would you like to have my seat? Whereupon the wee dwarf woman flew into a rage and said, oh, aye, because I'm a dwarf. You're offering me a seat simply because I'm a dwarf. Well, I have managed my whole life as a dwarf. It's not a problem to me. Keep your seat. The girl, cringing with embarrassment, went back to her seat, and the bus trundled on in silent embarrassment for a stop or 3. Then, oh, please be true, a big Glasgow woman was getting off the bus. And before she went up to the door, she went over to the wee dwarf woman. She said, I'm getting off the bus and I'm leaving my empty seat here. Because I'm a dwarf? You said, no, not because you're a dwarf, because you're another human being. I happen to be leaving the bus. My seat is vacant. I'm merely pointing it out to you that it exists. As a matter of fact, I thought you were extremely rude to that wee girl, and you owe her an apology.
I'll skip the punchline, but the point here is that the dwarf woman had become so paranoid and self-conscious, she was so primed to see discrimination everywhere, that when people were simply being kind to her as another human being, she was interpreting that as them being rude or mean or condescending. She no longer lived in a world of well-intentioned people offering basic acts of humanity. That's what it was. But instead, she lived in a world full of condescending monsters where everyone was out to mock her and be mean to her. Instead of seeing the world through this optimistic lens full of lovely people helping one another, through her lens, the world had become this cold, dark, cruel place to be. Everyone's mocking her. Everyone hates you, or everyone is condescending you. See what I'm trying to say here? Being primed to see discrimination had darkened her world and made her paranoid. Now, with the spread of intersectional theory in society, this paranoia has become very common, and good deeds like this are going punished every day all over the Western world. People who are simply being kind or courteous are being chastised because it's being interpreted as being racist or sexist or bigoted. If a man goes through a door and then he sees a woman behind him, so he just holds it open for her, that used to be seen as a basic act of courtesy for another human being. But intersectional theory has come along and started whispering in the ears of some women, men look down on you. They're making fun of you. They think you're weak. They're condescending you when they hold open the door, which leads some women to respond, oh yeah? You're holding the door open for me because I'm a woman? You think I'm too weak to open my own door? Well, I can open my own doors just fine. Thank you very much. I've been opening my own door my whole life, you sexist misogynist. It used to be that if a man had some information that he thought would be useful to a woman, he could impart that information. That would just be seen as a normal, courteous, human thing to do for another person. But now, for the same reason, it's being punished as mansplaining. Oh yeah? You're telling me this because I'm a woman, is it? You think I'm too dumb to figure this out for myself? And of course, the answer is no. It's not because you're a woman. It's because you're a human being. And if we want to create a nice, civilized, kind society, an open society, we're going to need to stop thinking the worst of one another. We're going to have to stop with the victimhood paranoia. Because what do you think the end result of this paranoia is? The result is that people stop offering their seats to one another on a bus in case they get shouted at. Men stop holding doors open for women in case they get shouted at, and they stop trying to help them with useful information even when they could give it in case they're accused of mansplaining. And consequently, because of all of this paranoia caused by intersectional theory, the world is becoming a less friendly, less warm, less open place to be. Nobody wants to be kind or courteous or even get involved with other people anymore in case you're accused of something that you didn't intend. And it's causing society as a whole to become more self-contained, less warm, less friendly, less open, more paranoid. A few years ago, there was an article in the BBC about how 98% of the English countryside population is white, and being a left-wing organisation, they went to find some of the 2% non-whites to try to dig up some stories of racism. And I remember reading these stories of so-called racism and thinking, this sounds kind of like paranoia to me. They found an Asian shopkeeper called Jag Patel who said, what's difficult is when people come into the shop and they quite clearly have a face at you. So picture the scene. A man comes into Jag's shop and he has a grumpy face. Now that could be for any number of reasons. Maybe he's having a bad day. Maybe he's had an argument with his spouse. He doesn't like the weather. Maybe that's just his face. But in Jag's mind, every look, every glance, every expression automatically becomes racism because that's what he's been primed to see all around him. The BBC also found an Asian author called Neil Chakraborty, and he said in his experience, victims are often left unsure if what they're experiencing is discrimination, being made to wait for food to be served in a restaurant or cafe, or sometimes even complete refusal. You feel uncomfortable describing this as racism because you're thinking, is this me? Am I being too demanding? Noticing people were crossing the street to avoid you. Why is this happening? Is it me? Am I intimidating? Persistent staring. And again, as I read that, I can't help but think that we've all experienced those things, haven't we? We've all been made to wait for food in a restaurant. In fact, it was Mother's Day here at the weekend. I was out for a family meal, but it was busy, so we had to wait quite a while for the food. But that's normal, that's natural. But because Neil has been primed to see racism everywhere, to him, this was racism. This was a racist attack. We've all walked into a restaurant and been told that they're fully booked and have no tables available as well, so we just have to go somewhere else. But to Neil, this is racism. We've all been walking along a road and someone up ahead has had to cross the street. Most of the time we don't even notice this, but if we do, it doesn't cross anyone's mind that this is a sinister thing. That's just probably where they need to go. But in Neil's mind, that's racism. He's avoiding me. I had a kid staring at me in church, At the weekend, that happens all the time. But in Neil's mind, when that happens, they're probably racist. They probably hate me. So you see how intersectionality has primed people to see every word, every act, every deed, every glance, every experience and interaction around them in the worst possible light. So they don't see a world of happy, lovely, warm people who just sometimes have a grumpy face when they go shopping, or sometimes are busy in the restaurant so the food takes a bit longer to arrive, or who unfortunately are fully booked, or people who sometimes just need to cross the street because that's where they're trying to get to. This all becomes racism. They just see a world of racists. It creates this paranoia. And consequently, it's made people withdraw from one another. It's made the world colder and more unforgiving. And this is another reason why intersectional theory simply needs to be thrown in the bin, and why we need to return to the Bible. The Bible says not to be paranoid about each other's intentions or to think the worst of them, but in fact, the opposite. It says to love one another, consider each other better than yourselves, share each other's burdens, be humble, be gentle with one another, and make allowance for each other's faults. So that means giving people your seat on the bus, holding doors open for each other, giving useful information when we can give it. And if someone does it for you, you don't lash out at them, but you thank them with a smile because they've been kind to you. It means showing grace. When someone's having a bad day and has a grumpy face on them, or when the restaurant staff are taking an extra 5 minutes to get your food ready or can't fit you in, you react humbly and you're kind and loving to those people. I'd rather live in a society filled with people following the Bible and doing things like that than the cold and paranoid society that intersectionality is making. I think everyone would. So in that case, there's only one thing to do. We need to get back to the Bible.